So without further ado, a big thank you to Gordon Frost, to Zoya Zayler, and to Ofelia Isabel and your respective organizations, Mercer, Accenture, and Willis Towers Watson, for first of all supporting us through the past few years, supporting us through the evaluations of organizations, the recommendations that we provide, and for being here today as well to talk about what we've been working on for all these years, why we've been doing this, what we can expect for the future, etc. So for the people in the audience, whether you are part of a certified organization or not, please feel free to put in the chat your questions, because we will be taking questions from the public. Madona, our Director of Operations, will be back after about 40 minutes of discussion to moderate a little Q&A session. And for those of you who are certified, then you'll be the lucky ones with the second link that you can join afterwards to go into the breakout rooms. So the first question that I have for our distinguished panelists today is, how can we assess whether gender bias actually exists in our performance management and our rating systems? So Zoya, we'll begin with you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And it's great to be here. Thank you for having me in this conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure to have worked with you over the past few years. You know, this is a loaded question, and I think one that we certainly struggle with. We've made a lot of progress, and there's still work to be done, absolutely, in the space. So what's worked for us at Accenture is we always anchor to our outcomes, right? So we look at, specifically if we look at gender as an example, right? When we look at our performance management process, we have a very rigorous evaluation where when we go through the performance management process, afterwards we take a look to see, do we have proportionate representation, right? So if, for example, at a specific level, there's 40% women, we expect that 40% of those promoted are also going to be women. And, you know, it's a very kind of complicated process, because we're not going to say, for example, if we look at a specific talent discussion and we see that in that discussion, maybe there's an underrepresentation, right? Our approach is not to go to those leaders and say, you need to absolutely, you know, meet this specific target, because I think that has its own host of unintended consequences. But what we do is we ask questions of, okay, we're seeing that we're not represented. Why is that, right? So then we really try and look at the root causes to see what happened within the specific peer group. Why do we have women who are underrepresented? Are we not staffing women in the same types of roles as men, right? Are they not in key decision-making roles? Is there something more going on from a cultural standpoint, right? And so we diagnose, and then we put a plan together for the future so that in future years, we actually address those root causes and get to a point where we actually have accurate, proportionate representation. So it's a very involved process, and I think that's what it takes. And again, I'm not going to pretend that we've solved it all right across the board, but we have seen a lot of really good progress, but it takes a lot of data, a lot of time, and a lot of rigor.
Deliberate action, absolutely. Thank you, Zoya. Who would like to jump in? Ofelia? Is there an echo? I'm sorry to interrupt. Is there an echo? I'm getting a text message. Are you hearing an echo?
Yes, we are. No.
Oh. Yes, we are?
Yes, we are, if possible to, yes.
Okay, I think the panelists are okay, let's just continue. Sorry about the interruption. Go ahead, Ofelia.
Sure. I agree with everything that Zoya said. What I would add is that I would start answering this question with the premise that a bias absolutely exists, right? Because we're all human beings, and we're taking in 11 million or billion, I forget what the number is, but an awful lot of information every second, and we've got to use our biases in order to survive. So I would start with that premise, and then I think focusing on outcomes, and using the resources that you have to take a fresh pair of eyes. So one thing that we've done is used our employee resource groups to actually take a look at our policies, programs, the way that we do every piece of the performance management system, and have them sort of let us know what we might be missing. Looking at it from that lens can give you some really great information. One thing that we found, we used to in our performance management, we used to ask our colleagues to self-evaluate, right? So as part of the year-end review, they would give themselves a rating before they talked to their managers. And what we found, we've now eliminated that practice because we found that overwhelmingly men rated themselves higher than their manager would have thought, and the women rated themselves lower. And because managers like the path of least resistance, we had the potential of allowing bias to seep in. So it's the little things, but I think data and leadership are going to be two things that come up through all of our discussion today.
Thank you, Ofelia. Gord?
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and I agree absolutely with what Zoya and Ofelia have both said, looking at the data, looking at your evidence, starting somewhere. So everybody has data that they can start with, and then you build on it over time, right? So at Mercer, we started doing this a number of years ago. The first year, you know, as Ofelia said, when you look at the data, it's hard to refute, right? It's hard facts. And you look at the data, you say, we can't explain this. There's no good explanation for why there would be such a big difference in ratings between men and women, or promotion. Or you can look at salary increase budgets, or the way the salary increase dollars have been distributed, or bonus dollar distributions. Like, I think, like, I would encourage people to look at all of those data points, which doesn't mean that it has to be exactly equal at all times to all people, right? You don't want it to be, you don't want people feeling like there's only one right answer, but it's by investigating it and looking at the data and putting the data in front of your leaders that you start to question it, and then you start to see changes in the outcome, right? And it may take you 2 or 3 years to start to see, you know, the outcomes that you would really want to see or expect to see, but it's by starting along that path and using your data and using the evidence to make better decisions that you start to make real progress.
Actually, I'm curious about one thing that wasn't part of the questions that I had in mind at the very beginning, but I've been reading more and more reports on, you know, the suggestion that performance management should be taken out, that there shouldn't be a regular, you know, at a fixed date evaluation, you know, evaluation process. What do you think of that? I've been reading that for the past few years, but recently it seems to be being, you know, to become more front and center. Should we remove the annual review?
So maybe I'll start, and I'm sure others will have lots to say on this very big topic. So in an ideal scenario, we don't need an annual review because people are getting on the spot feedback, right? It's what the next generation tells us that they want and need. They want honest, transparent feedback on a timely basis, sort of immediately. But until we create the cultures and we've trained our managers to be comfortable and make the time for that, and until it's embedded in our organizations, I think there is value in this forced process, because at least we're making sure that it happens. But I think everyone would agree it's not ideal, but it's the best that we have right now.
Agree. And Gord?
I was just saying that we could have a whole other webinar.
Yeah, I know.
Lots of organizations are talking about it, and they all want to, you know, when we interview clients, they tell us, I want to blow up my performance management project. It's not getting us the outcomes we want. Is it serving my needs? It's too oriented towards the process rather than the outcomes. Right. But to Ophelia's point, I wouldn't just do away with it altogether, because we do still need, I think, that formal process to ensure that it happens. But ultimately, it's the outcome of having good discussions about performance, timely feedback about development, really focusing it on developmental feedback, because that's what people are telling us they really, really want and value, rather than just the process of, you know, filling in a form or entering a rating. People don't like that as much. But right now, it's almost like a, you know, you have to have it, because if not, the whole thing kind of falls apart.
Yeah, and as I was asking the question, I was thinking to myself that I was opening a can of worms. So that will be a separate webinar indeed. Now I want to get to the question, and maybe Zoya, you can answer this one. The question of pay equity. It is so central, obviously, to everything that we do, right? There's no equality, there's no equity if there's still a gender wage gap, which we are still seeing, and which there was a recent report that was talking about even, more magnitude than what we originally thought. Now, conducting pay equity analysis, individual performance is not always factored in. And can it be, and how can we make sure that the individual performance is actually tied with the remuneration that we see?
Yeah, great question, Carolyn. And I think it absolutely can be part of, pay equity analysis. There are ways in which we can quantify performance, right? So for example, what we do at Accenture is we flag in any given year, right, people who have demonstrated distinguished achievement. They receive a specific distinguished achievement flag, right, that then separates, their performance from potentially others. And so when we go through a pay equity analysis, that can certainly be a part of it, right? So when, for example, you're analyzing people's pay and you find that you have a woman with, a distinctive achievement flag who's getting paid the same as a man, for example, without the flag, all else being equal, you can rectify that, right? So I think there are certainly very tactical ways in which we can quantify performance and make it part of a formal pay equity analysis.
So that could counter some of the unconscious bias that we see in the workplace.
Right, assuming that the decision, right, to assign that distinguished achievement or whatever you call it flag is debiased, which we know is also very difficult to do, right? So I think
exactly
the bias at multiple points in the talent life cycle.
Yeah. Ofelia?
I think it's important to sort of differentiate the compliance part of pay equity, right? And compliance is you're looking at job families. So you're not looking at individuals. There's probably no role for performance in that. But then I think what Zoya was talking about, I would call more sort of pay fairness. And outside of Canada, we can probably use those terms interchangeably, but because pay equity is such an important specific thing in Canada, I think it's important to use different language. It's when you're trying to assess pay fairness that you're looking at how you pay people and looking at it through a whole bunch of different variables. And you actually want the most important differentiator to be performance, right? You're hoping that the analysis shows that the people that are the high performers are the ones making more. But you're going to test variables like gender so that you can convince yourself that, there isn't any that's not coming into play. But that's the more sophisticated, I think, more meaningful and more forward-looking analysis that we, as Canadian organizations, we need to start doing more of.
Gord, do you have thoughts on how we can overcome unconscious bias in the workplace?
Yeah, so how to overcome unconscious bias, that's a big question, but I think it really does come back to looking at your data, right, as we talked about before, and being evidence-based. And to the point that Ofelia was making, if it's pay equity that you're looking at, there is this idea that in Canada, there's compliance, which is required by law, and it differs from Ontario to Quebec to federally regulated organizations. And I want to make sure that organizations don't think that just because I'm compliant, that I've got pay fairness, for instance, right? That's like the minimum requirement, is that you're compliant with the rules that govern whichever jurisdiction you're under. But I don't think you should just think that, oh, I'm fine, I don't need to worry about that anymore, right? There is a whole other level of investigation that I think organizations should be doing around pay fairness, around ensuring that there's not unconscious bias or bias of other kinds in your organization, whether it's around gender or ethnicity or other disadvantaged groups. And data, to me, is the key to unlocking all of that, because once you start with your data, and again, to the point I made earlier, your data doesn't have to be perfect, because many organizations are like, oh, my data set, not that robust, or it's in different places. You can start somewhere, and then you can build upon that over time, right? And so that's where I think you really can start. And even if you start with a certain population or a certain geographic region, or only some of the variables that you have a good handle on, it's something, and then you can build on that over time.
Do you feel with your clients that maybe the culture is shifting somehow and there's a little bit less unconscious bias these days?
Definitely the culture is shifting, right? So I don't know that there's less unconscious bias. I think there's definitely more awareness.
Right.
I think definitely this is higher on the list of priorities. And the reason I say that is just from a purely commercial perspective. We've been talking about the importance of this for years, but now as a consulting firm, we're actually seeing organizations wanting to spend money on it, right? And so that to me is the evidence that it's more important, because they're actually allocating dollars to doing the analysis, to understand where they stand, and to change. So I do think it's of a higher priority to people now than it was previously. Part of that is because of all of the news, in social media and in the broader news set, and visibility on that over the last year, which I think is a really, really good thing.
Zoya, what do you see with the organizations that you work with in terms of the activities or the initiatives they put in place to overcome these unconscious bias?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely echo what Gord said around clients and interest from clients, and clients willing to actually put their dollars to these, very, very important initiatives. In terms of what we're seeing, I think a lot of our clients are still really early in the journey, right? They're still trying to figure it out. They're trying to get the data that Gord was talking about. They're trying to understand, where do we have those biases? And that's what we would help them with, is trying to look at, their entire talent life cycle, look at what systems and processes are in place that may hinder progress, what cultural norms or behaviors are currently, a part of the workplace that need to change if we're going to have more equity. And so we're starting to see, a lot of organizations are focusing on, awareness and training and mindsets and leadership behaviors and creating a culture of inclusion. I think there's a lot of variation in terms of what we're seeing, but for the most part, I completely agree that the intent is there. The tough part is actually translating that intention into real, meaningful, sustainable action.
Right. Do you sometimes see that, and that question is for the three of you, that organizations will tie that with executive compensation, for instance?
Definitely more and more. So what we've seen, I'm sure across the board, a real interest on this topic from the board perspective. And another thing I found really interesting is that the board is not only has this on their agenda, but they're wanting to get involved more so than they have been in the past. So sort of an interesting sort of governance discussion there as well. But absolutely, it's more top of mind, and that's a needed thing in order for it to start to have an impact. I think in the you've all, I'm sure, familiar with the Osler diversity report, but there's some great stories there about large Canadian organizations that have put this as a metric in executive compensation, and I think that's a trend that we're going to continue to see more of.
Yeah, what gets measured gets done. What gets paid gets done.
Yeah,
Gord, you wanted to jump in?
And look, I think it's really exciting, because I completely agree. Like, the boards that I'm involved in are talking about it more, and I think just keeping it front and center and top of the agenda is really important. But this is the first year where I've been involved in boards where they're discussing executive pay adjustments. And there's been strong debate as to why should this female executive not have the same adjustment that this male executive would have? Or why should they not be paid at the same level? Their roles are of similar scope. Their impact is similar. Why would we not pay them the same thing? Those were debates that you never heard even 3 or 4 years ago. And now those are being had. And I do think that it has to start at the top, and then it filters through the whole organization. But the leaders, it starts with them, and the fact that they're discussing it at the board and at the executive table, I think, is very powerful.
I think that it's helped the external pressure that's been put on these topics, right? So institutional investors, consumers sort of voting with their dollars. I think that's put a whole other spotlight on this issue that I think we can expect to see more of. and that will help us get to parity, hopefully a little bit quicker than 180 years, I think you said.
Right, exactly. Well, couldn't agree more. And that's a great segue, Ofelia, to a topic that I also wanted to cover, which is the power of the purse and supplier diversity. You may be aware that about a year ago, actually right before the pandemic, on February 27th, we launched a very big historic partnership between two organizations, Women in Governance in Canada and the Girl Scouts of the USA. And so the Girl Scouts of the USA, people don't necessarily here in Canada realize how huge it is. It's a $1.2 billion organization with their headquarters on Fifth Avenue in New York. And they've decided that they wanted to make sure that their suppliers were aligned with their values. And they've got 10,000 vendors, and they said, listen, we don't want to spend our hard-earned dollars on organizations that might have very different views from what we believe in and what we are working on. And so that partnership is about bringing in organizations through the Parity Certification in the States, and actually Zoom video conference, which is the platform we're all on right here, right now, is the first American organization that Women in Governance has certified in the US through the Girl Scouts vendor. So what are your thoughts on what any organization can do to successfully promote supplier diversity? So on the one hand, so there's it's kind of twofold, my question. So on the one hand, making sure that your suppliers are aligned with your values and that they've got policies within the organization to encourage female leadership? And also, do you look at whether they are female-owned organizations and female-led organizations? Is that something part of your organizations, or do you have recommendations for your clients on that topic?
So I can start, for us at Accenture, absolutely supplier diversity has been a priority for many years. I think it starts with, asking the questions of your supplier. So as you mentioned, you can look at it in two ways. You can look at, are they a minority-owned business that is certified? And you can also ask, if not, what are their practices and do they align with our values? And so we do all of that. I think the other important thing is to make sure that you have metrics and you have goals, right? So we have set specific goals around a certain percentage of our suppliers, right, that would be diverse in multiple ways so that we can enable and help promote, right, the businesses of minority groups. And that's been very, very instrumental. And then I think at some point, when you reach a certain level of maturity, so the other thing that we've done is we actually launched, again, a number of years ago, a diverse supplier mentorship program, where we bring in diverse suppliers and we provide them with access to resources and tools and mentorship and funding, and open up networks for them so that even if we as an organization may not partner with them because of the nature of their business, right, we open doors for them to help them essentially grow their businesses. And again, I think that's something that comes with time, right, and with a certain level of maturity. But I think starting from, asking the questions, caring about this, being intentional, and then setting specific goals and targets.
Great. Gord?
Well, I would say, I think one of the interesting things I've seen is just, again, asking the question when you're selecting vendors. And we're getting asked that question now when we're getting selected also. So it used to be, tell me about your IT infrastructure, tell me about this. Now the question is, tell me about your policies and practices around gender diversity. Tell me what you're doing to ensure that you have equitable pay within your organization, right? Just asking those questions as part of your vendor selection process tells the community that this is important to you. And if you want to work with us, you need to demonstrate that you've got these practices in place, right? Those are questions that were never asked before. And so people could kind of, get by without having to do anything about it. Now, I think so the more that we ask for it, it demonstrates that it's important to us, the more that we'll see change from the broader community around it. And I think it could even be, this is kind of a shameless plug for Women in Governance, you could ask, are you Parity certified, right? That's a valid question, right? I think that would be great to see, because that's another way of saying, are you ISO certified, right? Those questions are valid questions. And even though people may not be, just putting it front and center encourages them and demonstrates that it's important.
Yeah,
exactly. In the States, Microsoft refuses to have any vendors who don't offer maternity leave to their female employees. So I thought that was an interesting one. Ofelia?
I was just going to say that I think we're now at the point where most organizations are asking the question and looking at the data. If I had a crystal ball, I would say that a few years down the line, it's actually going to impact who you decide to work with, right? We're still being kind about it. But I think that pretty quickly we're going to get to a different scenario where we won't work with somebody that isn't meeting a certain level of equity.
And institutional investors are actually more and more checking at boards, right? An all-male board, they don't want to invest in that organization simply right. Because there are so many research. I mean, your three organizations have done ample research that demonstrates the ROI on more diversity. So if you want your best return on your buck, you're not going to invest in an all-male board. And so the Caisse de dépôt, the Ontario, the Canada Pension Plan, who are actually both also certified with women in governance, as well as even in New York, they were actually one of the first pension plans. The New York State Pension Plan began with saying, you know what, we're done with putting our money there. But still, despite all these efforts, it's quite mind-boggling to see that a third of publicly traded organizations here in Canada don't have one woman. So we're not even looking at how close are we to parity. Are we at 20, 30, 40%? We're at 0% of women, 100% of men. Anyway. Another big question, I think, is on D&I initiatives that organizations put in place. Why do so many fall flat? Why do so many initiatives start big and exciting and then doesn't work out? What are the pitfalls that we should avoid?
I'm happy to start. So many of them fail because it's hard work, right? What we're asking people to do, like the status quo perpetuates inequality. Like we know that as a starting point. And so in order for these things to work, they need every single individual, right? From leadership all the way down to do something differently, to think differently. Zoya talked about mindsets and behaviors. Something needs to change, right? So that they so often fail because they're hard, they're messy. It requires leaders to have humility and empathy and get out of their comfort zone. It requires each of us to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And it's messy. It's messy work. I think that we're seeing a lot of shift to people really sort of getting it and being willing to put in the work. But the ones that do work, I think, have two pillars, two things in common. One is leadership, truly believing, not just sort of the academic research and that it matters, but truly in their hearts sort of believing that this needs to be done in order for the organization to be successful. And then the second one is measurement. Like what gets managed, what gets measured gets managed, and we need to do more of that.
So tone at the top and parity certification is what I'm hearing.
Right.
I'm learning from Gord. I'm learning from the best.
This is brilliant.
Here we go.
It's true.
Zoya, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I completely agree, Ofelia, with everything that you said. And I think, you know, as you said it, right, we're ultimately talking about not just changing our systems and processes, but we're talking about changing human beings, right? And that takes every one of us. And that is really, really hard, as Ofelia mentioned. I think the challenge is a lot of the IND or D&I initiatives, right, that we have don't really get at the core issues and the root causes that are going to lead to meaningful long-term change. I think a lot of times, you know, organizations ask themselves, you know, okay, how do we get more diversity, right? How do we get more women on our board? How do we get more BIPOC people? And, you know, I would encourage organizations to think about it, not how do we get more diversity, but why don't we have that diversity there to begin with, right? What is happening within our culture that's impeding, you know, diverse people from getting to the top? And looking at those systemic barriers, looking at, again, which behaviors are inhibiting progress, and then addressing that at the root that is a lot of long-term hard work that takes time, and it is very much a journey, but it's very much worth it, because I think that's the only thing that's going to lead to sustainable change, when you've got the leadership support and the measurement, as Ofelia mentioned.
Great. Gord?
The other thing that I wanted to add in is that it's sort of the one thing that sometimes is left unsaid. I think that this is something that more men need to get involved in also, right?
Love it.
So happy that you invited me onto the panel, because I think a lot of times this is not unconsciously, but it's unsaid. And it's always a lot of, women leaders that are on the panel, or, diverse people that are on the panel. And I think that, white men need to be involved in this too. And they can't just leave it to, women to fix the problem of gender parity, or disadvantaged people to fix the problems of diversity. Like, men need to get involved too. And I think they want to, like, I genuinely want to. I think other men want to also, but for whatever reason, they're not always stepping up and being part of it or being vocal about it. So I would encourage, everybody, including all the men who are on this call today, or that you work with, who are colleagues, like, their voices really do matter. And I think make a difference in changing the perspective across the board here. So
such an important point, Gord, and thank you so much for bringing it up, because it's a point that's very near and dear to my heart. I've always said, men have been part of the problem in the past, and they need to be part of the solution today. We're never going to attain our objectives if we're not working at it together. And 11 years ago, when I founded Women in Governance, from day one, I said our motto is going to be women and men working together to achieve gender parity. And my network at the time, when I was executive vice president in the corporate world and dealing mostly with men, I actually found it easier to bring men on board with my project to create Women in Governance. So extremely important that in the communication, anything that we talk about when it comes to these events, we make them feel welcome. And the same way that I say, we don't want any manels, we don't want all male panels, because there's always a woman who has something smart to say about any topic in the world. I also feel that it's important. And Ofelia, I think you wanted to jump in to say something.
I was going to congratulate Gord for having the courage to be here, and just go one step further and say that it's not even like men and women doing it together. We need men to be at the forefront of this, because men still hold the majority of the positions of power. Right? They're the only ones who can make the decision to go out and find a woman and promote her. And so we need them. Like, they actually play, I think, an almost bigger role.
Absolutely. So one last quick question before we open up the floor to Q&A, but it's a really, really important one. You know that 2 years ago, we've introduced intersectionality into our questionnaire. It is key for us that we make sure that all this progress that we're seeing is not just for the white women, but that we take into account the added obstacles that can be that women of color, women non-binary or women with disabilities, etc., have a chance to also contribute to our economy. So how can we make sure that we bring along the most vulnerable women in this process?
So I can start, and I feel like we've talked about data a lot, but I'm going to say it again. I think you've got to have the right data in place that's going to tell you where you have issues and where you need to focus your efforts, right? Because I think we can look at gender in isolation, and maybe we see that we have gender parity, at all levels. But if all of those women are white women, right, you're leaving a whole number of other groups behind. And so I think it's really important to gather data within your organization on race and ethnicity and sexual orientation and gender identity, in addition to legal gender, right? And then break it down and look at, what does the representation look like within our leadership team? Does it look the same as the bottom of our pyramid? And if not, and in most cases it won't, right? Where do we have gaps? And again, where do we need to intervene? I think it's really, really important. And I think it's important, you talked, Caroline, about intersectionality, right? I think it's really important to look at the different identities together. Because again, to give an example, you could look at, let's say, your most senior level of leadership, and you're doing well on gender and you're doing well on, let's say, BIPOC. But what you might see is that when you intersect the two, you actually have very few, let's say, Black women, and all of the Black people that you have might be men, and all of the women that you have might be white, right? And so, because we know that there are additional barriers when you have multiple levels of identity. So again, I think going back to the data, analyzing it, identifying the root causes, and then developing interventions along with the minority groups who can help shape what exactly you need to do to address the problem.
Ofelia?
It's another humongous topic, but maybe two things that may be tangible. One is we try to lead with inclusion. So try and get everybody's voice heard. And the hope is that if you really sort of create an inclusive culture and you look for everybody's voice, that you'll start to get more of the different groups represented. The diversity will come across all of the spectrums. The other one I'll point out is we've a real effort to stop hiring or promoting based on fit. Right? My entire career, it was always like that person is a good fit and that's why we'd hire them, right? And so it's been a lot of work to, over the last 12 months, sort of recognize that that is perpetuating the status quo, and you must stop doing that. Like, we need to be looking to complement, and we need to get comfortable hiring and embracing somebody who purposefully looking for not a fit. But
that's actually the difference between diversity and inclusion, right? Attracting diversity is one thing, and it's an important thing. But then if you don't make these people feel welcome with their differences and that they actually bring something to the mix, and if you want them to fit in, then what's the point? You've just, your whole inclusion component, you've just kiboshed. Gord, last word before we open up to the floor to Madona and her cues, questions from the public.
Sure. So the last thing I would add on that topic is going back to agree with data, absolutely. And then the point from earlier about leadership and accountability, right? So one of the things that we've done, again, to Ophelia's point, not just looking at fit, but now the new mantra is, did you look at a diverse slate of candidates, right? Like, did you look at a diverse slate of candidates? From our leaders, we're insisting upon it, and it filters through. So now we're celebrating the fact that when we go out and look for new candidates for roles, and we find, like, guess what? Now that we've said we have to look for it, we're finding it. Like, the diverse candidates are out there, right? So, and then we celebrate when we find one that we actually hire. And, we made an offer last week and they had 3 other offers because everyone wants them now, which is great, right? But now it's our focus. And because it's the focus from our leaders, it's actually getting traction.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for your unbelievably enlightening comments. The 3 of you have been fantastic. Madona, I'm sure you've got great questions coming from the public.
Indeed, we have so many interesting questions. I think we have very few minutes to cover a few questions. And just to comment on Gordon, we have a lot of questions coming from men. So this is a good sign. One question that I got, and we've covered, you guys have covered a bit on it, but I think it would be when companies have offered every opportunity and opened doors for women to participate in leadership roles, and you still don't get feedback or interest from women, what do you recommend those organizations to do differently?
I heard a really good answer to a similar question from a CHRO friend the other day, and her response was simply try harder. And I won't stop the answer there, but I wanted to share that because it really resonated with me. We do need to try harder. The data shows us that women are less likely to put up their hands unless they are able to. They've already demonstrated they can do 100% of the job. Right? Whereas a man with 50% will put his hand up. We know that. So I think we need to do a better job of tapping women on the shoulder and encouraging them. I'll stop there, but just a couple of ideas.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I will also add that I think you also need to look at what does the culture look like if maybe there's a reason why women are not raising their hands. Part of it, I think you're totally right, Ofelia, right? The data shows us that women are less likely to do this. And maybe there's also more to it. Maybe there aren't that many female role models that are in those roles now, or maybe the female role models that are there aren't exhibiting the kind of leadership behaviors that other women look up to. We have seen that, unfortunately, as well, right? And so I think it's looking at what does the current situation look like, and maybe asking the women, why aren't you interested in this? What would it take to get you to be interested in these roles? And I bet you'll find a lot of very interesting insights that maybe you hadn't previously considered.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question that came, and it comes for organizations that need to look into their customers. So how do we, as organizations, or what do you recommend for organizations to reach out and be inclusive towards in their services and products that they are provided towards their clients, not only their internal stakeholders?
So I would say first you need to have people who understand your clients and have the experiences of your clients and look like your clients, right? You have to be representative of the communities that you serve and the clients that you work with. I think that is really, really key. I'll leave it at that and just let my other panelists add some insights also.
I think, Zoya, your response sort of covers anything that I'm not sure that I understand the question. Is it how do we get more diverse customers?
How do we make sure that our services and products are diversified enough that they include people from underrepresented or clients from underrepresented groups?
I think having your people look and mirror the customers that you want is a great place to start. You'll learn a lot by doing that and interacting with that type of person.
And maybe just one other idea is, we did some analysis a little more than a year ago, and we look, because so Mercer has offices across Canada, and we have data on our populations in each of those offices, and we just collected demographic data about those geographies, right? So we looked at the demographic breakdown of Toronto, of Montreal, of Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, and we said, does our population mirror the population of the broader community that we're a part of? Again, so going back to the discussion earlier, starting with your data, that was an easy place for us to start because we had our own data. We were able to gather data around the local community, and then we just compared and we asked the question, why is it not the same? Or where is it not the same? And what could we do to start making a difference there?
And maybe one other final thought I'll add is also just to make sure, especially if you're thinking of products, right, to make sure that the teams that are developing the products are also reflective of your customers, right? And because at the end of the day, it's very, very hard to develop a product for people that you may not have lived experiences about, right? So having a diverse team that's actually developing your product will lead to more innovation and will be able to better address the needs of your customers.
100%. Thank you so much. I don't think we have enough time for a second question, Caroline.
I think you can take one last question.
Okay. I have one question that was interesting as well from before. It was related to performance. It was right after you asked your question, Caroline. So with the new trend or the new reality that we're living, and women are choosing or opting to work more from home, especially mothers, how do you recommend, or what do you recommend for organizations to mitigate the factor that women who are opting for this, they're not even considered, or they're not considered in their decision to be promoted or moving up in the leadership roles?
I'm happy to start on that one because we just did a study. Willis Towers Watson, we looked around the globe and we found that 80% of people are telling us that they do not want to come back to the office. on a regular basis. And it's interesting that we asked the question from a work-life balance perspective. I think that what we're finding, and I'm sure you'd all agree, is that working from home has actually given us less work-life balance, right? What we've seen is an increase in productivity and a much harder job of finding some sort of healthy balance, right? Burnout is what we're all sort of talking about now. So I think organizations are going to have to figure out how to manage and work with a group of people, men and women, that are going to be hybrid. Sometimes they'll have FaceTime and sometimes they won't. And it's going to be a really huge adjustment for organizations and for managers to learn that. But if I think about what we learned in the past year of sending everybody home and being as successful as we've been, we're capable of anything when we have to be.
The other thing I would just add to that is, I mean, that is coming through in a number of the employee surveys that we're doing and the work that we're doing, is there is this concern, right? Of if I'm not in the office and others are, will I get the best assignments? Will I have the same opportunities for advancement? Will I get the same coaching, right? So that's one of the key concerns with a future flexible working type of arrangement. Right. And so to me, the starting point is just to be very open and transparent about it, recognize that there is a potential risk there. And again, starting with the leaders, having the right, like all the stuff we talked about before, having alignment with your people managers and your frontline managers to ensure that they recognize that that is a risk and that you're actively attempting to address it to ensure that it doesn't manifest itself is where you need to start. And then looking at your data afterwards to say, you know, did we evaluate people fairly, or do we think there may have been some bias? And if so, what do we do about it?
Exactly. I think, and I will just add that, you know, I think this is another one where it is a cultural shift, right? And so when we talk about evaluating people's performance or deciding, you know, who gets promoted or who gets the next juicy assignment, it's really about looking at impact. What impact did this person make? And making sure that our people are asking themselves, you know, is this person actually making a bigger impact, or do I think that because I happen to have more FaceTime with them in the office, right? So I think back to Gordon's point around being honest about that and having those conversations. And one other thing I would add is also it's just really important to make sure that women aren't the only ones who are working remotely, right? Because we know that women are the ones that have, you know, disproportionately more of the caregiving responsibilities. So encouraging our men to also work remotely and lead by example, and you know, try to create more of an, you know, a balanced workplace that way.
Yeah, and if I just, in conclusion, can add to what you just said, Zoya, which is exactly the point I was going to make, is that the danger that I see is when we decide as women to spend more time at home saying, okay, well, now we're back in the office. It's a hybrid model. I can work from home as much as I want, and that's going to be my choice. And I do believe that more men will decide to be in the office than women. And so then what's going to happen when the laptop closes and the Zoom closes and the men are together in the office making the big decisions? Are we going to be excluded from that? Is there going to be the good old boys club back in town? We need to be very cautious, which is why, you know, I say, yes, work-life balance. I mean, depending on what your ambition is and what your choice is. But just like when I say, you know, when you decide that, and you know, I have children of my own, and I think it's extremely important to have as many as you want and take as much time as you want. But at the end of the day, if we are gone for 4 years from the office, it's kind of difficult to catch up with the men who've been in the office during that whole time. And I think it's kind of the same danger that is luring, because if they're in the office 5 days a week, so maybe the organization should not allow that. You know, maybe everybody needs to be in a hybrid model, because otherwise we are going to be disadvantaged, and I can feel it coming.
We need to start looking at even maternity leaves differently, right? There's lots that women learn when they're off having children about teamwork, about empathy, about like leadership skills that like we have to stop looking at that as just some sort of gap and a need to catch up. That they're learning different skills, focusing on different things that are requirements for any good leader. So, but we have to be intentional about it, I think, is your point. And you're absolutely right. We can't just let this happen, because we will take steps back. So we need to be intentional.
If there's one thing we've learned in this pandemic is that, you know, this she session that hit us, and it always makes me think of Simone de Beauvoir, who used to say that, you know, never take women's rights for granted. You know, I don't know the saying in English, but it's the minute that there's any crisis, whether it's economic, religious, social, that's the first thing that takes a back seat. It's women's rights. So voila. So it's 1 o'clock. I don't want to take any more time from the people who have joined us for just this 1 hour, because those who are members of organizations that don't have the Parity certification yet will sign off, and the others who are members of the Parity certified organizations will join us into the next with the different links. So there's a few minutes gap here that we're giving you until you join us on the breakout rooms, where some great discussions will take place. And I just want to thank you again, thank the panelists. You've been exceptional. It was a true joy to work with you. Madona, thank you for your great moderation as well. And for those organizations that have the certification, please continue to work with us. We've got more than a 90% retention rate year after year, simply because organizations do understand the value of remeasuring every year. And for those platinum organizations, they know very well that each year it's a little bit harder. Our criteria is a little bit more stringent, and that's how it should be. And for those who are contemplating joining these wonderful organizations, there's huge value, and we really hope that you will engage with us and that we can support you through this important journey. Alors voilà, we're signing off, and we'll see you on the next Zoom link. Thank you, everyone.